times people write to me and say, I'm interested in Tolkien, I would like to study Tolkien, I would like to write my degree dissertation on Tolkien, but my teacher or my professor says that Tolkien is not a proper subject, that it is something that we do not study in schools, that we do not study in universities. I really wrote the book, Autore del Secolo, to try to show people like that there were places where Tolkien was taken seriously. I think it is unlikely that I'm going to convince their professors at this late stage, but there are many students there who would like to study Tolkien, and I feel they should have someone saying seriously and thoroughly that Tolkien is an author who deserves just as much serious treatment as any author of what we call the mainstream. So you could say that I wrote the book for a group which I felt to be disadvantaged students. Well, in a way, of course, Tolkien is not a typical author of the 20th century. People notice that straight away. He writes about a world which is almost entirely his own. Nevertheless, what struck me when we started getting the big polls and public opinion questionnaires about authors was that the authors who very often came in the top 5 or the top 10 were in some ways rather like Tolkien. There were authors like George Orwell and William Golding and Kurt Vonnegut and T.H. White and Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis, of course. And they all wrote fantasy, and most of them were veterans of serious warfare. So I felt that actually, although Tolkien might not look like a typical author in what he writes about, in some ways his themes are those of the unfortunate and really rather horrible 20th century, which are industrialized warfare. And a return to one could always say medieval conditions, which we thought during the 18th and 19th centuries we Europeans had put behind us. The strange thing actually is that all of these authors writing, I think, about very serious and real topics of which they had first-hand personal experience, nevertheless felt that they could only write what they wanted to write through the medium of fantasy. So in that respect, in taking a serious theme in a fantastic mode, in that respect, Tolkien is a typical author of the 20th century. It's just, I think, that far too many of my professional critical colleagues have not realized this. They don't pay very much attention to what people prefer to read, and as I said in my last answer, they say there's a lady in the New York Times wrote it just recently, Tolkien is not literature. But then, who are they to decide what is literature? Literature, in the end, is what people read, and Tolkien has certainly been successful in that respect. And of course they say that because obviously he is, that is so. But again, one of the striking things which you find in authors other than Tolkien, including authors who I have not mentioned so far, is that they felt that, in a strange way, medieval literature was more relevant and more serious for them than the writing of, again, the 18th and the 19th century. They felt in some respects that they had returned to a medieval world. Robert Graves, the famous author of Claudius the God and I, Claudius, he, like Tolkien, was a fusilier in the First World War. Like Tolkien, he thought of himself as a poet, but when he wrote his autobiography, Goodbye to All That, he said he went to Oxford, at very much the same time as Tolkien, actually, presumably they were both there together, and he was told that medieval literature was sort of just something you had to do. It had nothing to do with real life. But he said, actually, to him, it had everything to do with real life. He had just emerged from a medieval conflict, which was fought with knives and maces and clubs in the dark. And he said reading Anglo-Saxon literature seemed to him to be much more normal, much more real than reading the 18th century literature of the Salon and the Enlightenment. So Tolkien is a medieval and an anachronistic author, but unfortunately, the 20th century rapidly became anachronistic. Well, I just pick one out, which I think is often ignored, which is that Tolkien thought of himself as a poet. And of course he was a poet. I haven't actually tried to count the number of poems by Tolkien that we have, but there must be more than 100. And they are sometimes difficult to evaluate because they are, many of them, but not all of them, are embedded in a story. But I think that Tolkien thought correctly that he was not inventing all this for himself, that he was reviving a tradition of English poetry which had been very powerful, had been forced out of sight by modern times, but had survived, actually, as these things often do, like fairy tales, in the kind of underworld of sub-literature in popular forms. I am now in the United States of America, where a common musical form is country and western singing. But quite often in country and western songs, I hear lines of poetry which actually fit medieval meters absolutely perfectly. I know that the authors do not know anything about the Middle Ages and have never heard of any of the medieval poems, but they are still singing orally in the same tradition as their grandfathers and their grandfathers' grandfathers and so on back for hundreds of years. This again is a phenomenon which has not been noticed by professional critics. I have to tell you that for many years I was the head of department of at a university, and as a result of listening to all those meetings in which my colleagues argue all the time and then don't do anything, the character I feel most sympathy with is Ugluk the Orc, the one who captures Merry and Pippin. He too has to deal with a very unruly and awkward band of followers who don't do what they're told, and he deals with it the way I would like to. He steps forward and he cuts a couple of heads off, and he says, "Everybody do it my way." I can't help. I've felt so many times that I would like to be just like Ugluk. Apart from that, I think other great scenes are, of course, the coming of Rohan. The scene at the end of the Siege of Minas Tirith, when Gandalf is standing at the gate of Gondor, and he hears the cock crow, and he sees the Nazgul hesitate, and then he hears the horns blowing of Rohan. Rohan had come at last. That was, I think, Tolkien's favorite scene, and I think it is one of my favorites as well. That would take me a long time, but perhaps the principal difference is that The Lord of the Rings is written in the mode of, shall we say, the bourgeois novel. It has a developed realism. It gives you a lot of detail. It gives you a great deal of dialogue. It tells you what the characters are thinking and what they are feeling. It is full and ample. It tells you, as it were, much more than you need to know. The Silmarillion is written more in the style of a medieval chronicle, and even more in the style of a medieval Icelandic saga. So it seems to us to be very abrupt. It does not tell us things that we need to know. The characters, when they talk very briefly. We move quickly from one event to another. There is a sense of crowding and I won't say haste, but of getting on from one event to another. It's also, of course, as we all know, very difficult to remember, because it is vital to remember who the characters are and who they are related to. And with our feeble, weak, modern memories, we cannot always remember who is whose cousin, or or exactly what relationship there may be between, shall we say, Tuor and Turin Turambar. They walk past each other at one point. They don't speak. It's a vital moment in a way. But if you ask me now, how is Tuor related to Turin Turambar? I'd say, well, I think they're cousins, but I'd have to look at a pedigree, at a genealogical table to answer that question. But I know it's an important question. So I think, in a word, the Silmarillion is very much more compressed than The Lord of the Rings, and that is what makes it hard to read for us. I'm much more used to answering the other question, what the two poems, the two works share. A very short answer then is that The Lord of the Rings has hobbits. Both Beowulf and The Lord of the Rings have giants, and they have elves, and they have dragons, and they have a sense of immense history behind them. But The Lord of the Rings has hobbits, and Beowulf does not have hobbits. And along with the hobbits comes the sense of anachronism, the sense of the world of Tolkien's own boyhood. I won't call it the modern world, but a more modern world which exists in the center of Middle-earth. Not only does The Lord of the Rings have the hobbits, it also has the Shire, which gives us a kind of center of normality, which of course is quite alien to Beowulf. And it also has characters like Tom Bombadil, who I think may have some very faint resemblances in Anglo-Saxon literature, but not in Beowulf. So perhaps I would say that The Lord of the Rings is, as I say, a work of the 20th century. And the way that the 20th century gets into The Lord of the Rings is through the hobbits and the Shire. Been the most influential. It is what all the fantasy authors that follow him try to do, more or less successfully, is to create a world. Tolkien gave us Middle-earth. It is true that Tolkien did not think that Middle-earth was his own invention. He thought that he was reviving it from an ancient period, but he made Middle-earth habitable for modern writers. I think that's the first and the most important thing. I think the second thing is that Tolkien, in his work, produced a very complex structure, and his imitators have sometimes tried to imitate that, and I think have always failed. They have not been able to put together the multiple-stranded plot, the interlaced plot, which Tolkien managed to write and to make successful. I think a third point, which I think is very important but also very obscure, I find it difficult, is that Tolkien does have a philosophical standpoint, and he tries to convey this, but the strange thing is that he conveys it through the plot. it is the cross connections in the plot which tell us, I think, what Tolkien thought about, as I say, luck and fate and providence. But although I've tried to explain this, every time I read The Lord of the Rings, I find more connections. And I just hope that one day I can get this straight in my head. But I think one thing Tolkien is saying is that human minds are not able to understand providence. We do not have enough capacity. We just have to be aware that it exists. But we can't ourselves expect to see it. And that is my experience with reading Tolkien. I cannot take it all in at the same time. And finally, I would say that Tolkien is very capable of creating striking and interesting characters, and as I've said before, the hobbits are a great invention, and that is like nothing else that existed in the world, I think, until Tolkien invented them. In the 20th century, I can't think of any, because they don't believe in it anymore. In the 19th century, some of the great English authors write fables of Providence. I would say perhaps the most striking of these is the female author writing under a false name who called herself George Eliot. Her novella, Silas Marner, in a way, is a kind of study of Providence and of Boethius. And I do not know if Tolkien read this, but if he had, he would have recognized, I think, and been amused by the way that George Eliot rewrote Boethius in a very firmly English environment. So George Eliot perhaps is one writer. Another of a very different kind is Charles Dickens. But Dickens, while I think a great and a brilliant novelist, was not a thinker. So his presentations of Providence do not have the learning and the deliberate connections which Tolkien or George Eliot would have. Nevertheless, his novels are often a strange study in the nature of coincidence. And of these, I think perhaps the best is the Polish author writing in English, whom we call Józef Konrad Korzeniowski. But Konrad, I think, again, a man who had lived an active life and who had considerable non-literary experience, for he was a ship captain and a master mariner. He wrote about courage and endurance very powerfully. He wrote also about cowardice very powerfully. Perhaps we should say that his, yes, you would like this, I think. His great model of courage is the novel Nostromo, Our Man. And yet, in a way, it ends, I think, as a study of, not of cowardice, but of someone who eventually fails a test. But Nostromo, I think, is a work which tells us a great deal about courage, and in a way also about luck. I will not say providence, but luck. And the answer is, I think, that Christians are well able to see his benevolent intentions towards themes of religion, but non-Christians are quite capable of reading The Lord of the Rings without thinking about it at all, because, as you know, there is no evident religion in The Lord of the Rings. The riders do not appear to have a religion. When they bury Theoden, they have a kind of ritual, but it is not presided over by a priest, and there is no suggestion of religious hope when they construct the barrow. And in the same way, the hobbits, we know that the hobbits get married where? In church. They don't have churches. In the town hall? Possibly. Who presides? Is it a priest? No, they don't have priests. Perhaps it's the mayor or one of the sheriffs. Well, we don't know. There really is no suggestion of religious grounding for the societies in The Lord of the Rings. And yet, there is a strong sense, I think, that what we are looking at here is, in Christian terms, a fallen world, a world which is waiting for salvation, and which cannot achieve lasting salvation by its own efforts. As all the wise characters tell us, what they're doing is fighting the long defeat, because there is no ultimate victory possible within the terms of Middle-earth. Any ultimate victory must come from outside, and it has not come yet. I will say only this, that I have talked about Tolkien and what I regard as the true tradition of literature. Let me just say that the true tradition which Tolkien talks about is more powerful in mainstream literature than is often noticed. That the great English poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Tennyson are in many ways medievalizing poets, and poets like Wordsworth or Coleridge who very deliberately go back to the oral traditions of ballad poetry. And again, you see this in authors like Sir Walter Scott, himself a great collector of ballads and a great creator of ballads. And this tradition goes on through authors like William Morris and I suppose Swinburne, and on into Tolkien's own time. It tends to be pushed aside in modern terms, but once again, it is a powerful feature. And one should not forget that the works which I regard as the works of the true tradition have remained immensely popular. The most popular work in English in the 20th century, apart from the Bible, is Tolkien, and the most popular work in the 19th century in German, apart from the Bible, is Jakob Grimm, with the Grimm's fairy tales, which everybody in Europe now knows. Well, these are both works of the true tradition, and if we have the most popular work of the 19th century and the most popular work of the 20th century, that's two pretty good scores for the medieval tradition. This takes me on to the question whether the critical mainstream will accord literary value to the works of Tolkien. And of course, no, they won't. They won't. And I can say quite simply why. The critical mainstream is dedicated to the notion of modernism. And of course, nowadays it is postmodernism, but there's not a lot of difference. And modernism actually is a work of my great-grandfather's time. It goes back to 1920. It's not really modern at all. They just say it is, and it has a notion, I think, of modernity and of what the 20th century, which was going to be right, which turned out to be completely wrong. So in many respects, it is an archaic, conservative, conformist mode, but I'm afraid it has become dominant in the critical mainstream, and this is one reason why the critical mainstream has failed to attract students and is certainly in the United States of America, steadily withering. Students don't turn up. The universities close courses, and I think that's because we have people sticking determinedly to something which didn't work. Well, it's a pity that it is a great pity, I think, that there is not enough study of fantasy and of science fiction and of the other popular modes of modern life. But just the same, that is what has happened. The success of fantasy, which was not supposed to happen, challenges the authority of the critics. The critics say, we are the ones who decide what is literature. You have no vote. And then, of course, the reading public says, well, we don't care what you think. We are going to read whatever we like. And if we decide to call it literature, well, we will. Or if you say we can't call it literature, we'll call it something else, but it won't make any difference. So I think you have here a characteristic challenge to an entrenched authority. And entrenched authorities, especially when they are bureaucracies, hate any sort of challenge and will try to deal with it by saying it does not exist. I don't know. It is a great problem in modern life, Franco. How do we get rid of bureaucracies? I don't know. There's the authority challenge. There's also, I think, in the case of Tolkien and Lewis, their determined religious traditionalism. It's the fact that they are Christians. And another thing about modernism was it felt that all that kind of thing was just over, passé, out of date, no need to bother about it anymore. I always say actually that to me, I think, perhaps I say to my colleagues, to my critical colleagues, people like Tolkien and Lewis and Orwell, they're like vampires. You think they're dead, and you've put a stake through their hearts and buried them at the crossroads, and it's all over. And then someone drops a bit of blood on them, and they're alive again. When they see someone like Tolkien, or indeed someone like Orwell, they see the Middle Ages coming back. And they find that very hard to bear. And yet, one of the things I try to do in Autore del Secolo is to explain why this has happened. It is a phenomenon, whatever you think about it, whether you like it or not, it is a phenomenon, and the phenomenon deserves an explanation. If you do not have an explanation for it, then you do not have a literary theory. And for all the talk these days about literary theory, we still do not have a good theory about fantasy. I don't think there are very many bad points, but every now and then you feel that he has to reach out for an audience of teenagers, of female teenagers, and he has to do something to amuse them. So that there's a scene in which Legolas skateboards down the steps at Helm's Deep. I can't help thinking that skateboarding is not really part of Middle-earth. All right. And then there's Gimli, who is made into a butt, a comic figure. There are those jokes about dwarf tossing. I don't know quite what is funny about dwarf tossing, but it seems to be a popular idea in the United States of America and in Australia, but I hope nowhere else. And I just don't think we needed those jokes, so there we are. The good things. The good thing is that Jackson is quite prepared to be quiet and not to be noisy. There are some very good, quiet scenes. In the third movie, there's a violent action scene where the trolls battering down the door to get into the second level of Minas Tirith. And during this, Gandalf sits with Pippin, who's afraid, and talks to him very quietly about death, and consoles him in a way, taking the words from an earlier chapter of The Lord of the Rings, which Jackson has taken out and inserted at this point. And that's very moving, I think. In the same sort of way, it's a very good scene, I think, in the Council of Elrond, which Jackson has changed very much from its original. And in his scene, it ends up, as it does not in Tolkien, it ends up with everybody shouting and arguing with each other. And in the middle of this, Frodo says, "I will take the ring." And nobody hears him because they're all shouting. But Gandalf hears and turns towards him. And Frodo again says, "I will take the ring." And everybody goes quiet because they've realized that Gandalf is paying attention to Frodo, not to them. And then Frodo says, "I will take the ring, but I do not know the way." Well, that's different from the way Tolkien did it, but I think very powerful and very suggestive. So one other quiet scene, actually, again changed from its original place. In Tolkien, Frodo, when he realizes what's happening quite early on, says to Gandalf, I wish this hadn't happened in my time. And Gandalf says, so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. Well, Jackson takes this out of its context and has Gandalf talking to Frodo in the mines of Moria. There's nobody else listening, it's all quiet, and there's just the two of them talking quietly. And then, at the very end of the first movie, when Frodo is about to set off on his own, he hears Gandalf, who he thinks is dead, talking to him. And you see Gandalf projected onto the screen, and there's a voiceover, and it says the same words, but this time it doesn't say them, it says you. All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given you. So it becomes much more direct and much more personal. Well, there are several moments like that, I think, and I appreciate the way that Jackson has kept his thoughts on the core of the original story and not been completely distracted by the violent scenes and the action scenes. Well, Franco, I hope this has come out well. I know the microphone is not very good, and I've tried to talk as loudly as I can, but I hope you'll be able to turn the volume up when you get this tape so that you will be able to hear me properly. Right, I'm going to stop now. My best wishes to you, Franco, and to the whole conference at Brescia. Thank you.